No, this is the route because we run cattle and the whole forest land. No, these areas pretty different.
Okay. Okay.
And I actually have,
It's hot.
Okay.
Do you want some water?
Oh, sure. I made it later. That's fine.
Sorry, Karl, I should offer.
No, I wasn't thinking about it until you brought it up.
Good afternoon, and thank you for coming to this workshop. My name is Gregory Josten, and I'm the state forester for the state of South Dakota, and I work for the South Dakota Department of Agriculture. Our panel is the South Dakota Experience, and joining me up here today to my right is Mr. Jim Nyman, and he is the president and chief executive officer of Neiman Enterprises Incorporated. And to his right is Mr. Karl Jensen. He's a rancher and president of the South Dakota Association of Conservation Districts. And to his right is Mr. Bob Paulson, the former Western Dakota's program director for the Nature Conservancy. And each one will have a few minutes to give his remarks. First of all, I'd like to mention just a couple of things. Kind of picking up at Troy's introduction a few minutes ago, he talked a little bit about the Farm Bill and how it has impacted management in different parts of the country, and particularly in the West. And so I just want to touch on a few things that came out of the Farm Bill and how we have been implementing them here in South Dakota. First of all, the 2014 Farm Bill directed the Secretary of Agriculture to designate, at the request of the governor, landscape scale areas as part of an insect and disease treatment program areas in states that are experiencing insect or disease epidemics. In South Dakota, Governor Dugard submitted a map of the Black Hills National Forest, delineating an area that included National Forest System lands in Lawrence, Meade, Pennington, and Custer counties. These areas were the ones that are affected by the mountain pine beetle epidemic that the governor talked about. And I think that that designation, that insect and disease risk map designation, was beneficial to the Forest Service and their ability to respond to the mountain pine beetle epidemic. Another thing that came out of the Farm Bill was the permanent authorization of good neighbor authority for both the BLM and the Forest Service to all 50 states. The agreement allows states to perform watershed restoration and forest management activities on National Forest System and BLM lands. Right now, we're in the process of getting a master agreement signed. I believe we're in the signature phase of that. It's being circulated for signature, so we hope to have that tool available to us here within the next couple of weeks. The Farm Bill also authorized the development of stewardship agreements. The state has not entered into a stewardship agreement yet with the Forest Service. However, Pennington County is working under a stewardship agreement with Black Hills National Forest, and you'll probably hear more about that during a panel discussion tomorrow. So with that, I'm going to be quiet and turn this over to Mr. Nyman.
Thank you, Greg. Appreciate. And my name is Jim Nyman, and I'm a third generation in the forest products business, and this is our 80th year in business. I'd like to begin by thanking Governor Dugard and his wife and the Western Governors Association for hosting this meeting to discuss management on national forest and grasslands. Our company owns 5 facilities, 4 here in the Black Hills, 3 sawmills, and 1 pellet operation, and a sawmill in Colorado. These mills provide almost 500 direct jobs and support over 275 indirect contract positions, or families as you might perceive them. Here in the Black Hills National Forest is the primary forest landowner and principal supplier of timber. As a result, our company purchases over 75% of our timber sales from the Black Hills National Forest. And we rely heavily on a consistent forest management program. Black Hills National Forest has a long history of leadership in the national forest management, beginning with case number 1, the first U.S. Forest Service timber sale in the United States back in 1899. The most significant single issue regarding the Black Hills National Forest is the long-term health of the forest as we perceive it, and how that affects the forest management program and timber outputs. Since the late 1990s, we've seen a devastating mountain pine beetle epidemic kill trees in about 150,000 acres, and we've had forest fires on over 200,000 acres on the Black Hills National Forest. I've seen firsthand how effective forest management can be used in preventing and responding to mountain pine beetle outbreaks. And there are numerous success stories where active management has been implemented. While some fires of mountain pine beetles are natural, a substantial body of research for Forest Service and other scientists that go clear back to the early 1900s clearly shows that proactive forest management has a significant and helpful influence on fire behavior and bark beetle epidemics. The underlying concepts are very, very simple. First, overstocked ponderosa pine forests are more susceptible to insects and to severe fires. Number 2, thinning ponderosa pine forests to reduce stalking will reduce susceptibility to fire insect epidemics. Unfortunately, for the last 20 years, this research has not been adequately incorporated into the management plans or on-the-ground management of the Black Hills National Forest. This photo that you can see behind me, and I hope it's up, yes, this photo shows that you can see at the bottom the thinned and the unthinned stands during the current pine beetle epidemic. It's also a real life example of how the pine beetle epidemic could have been largely prevented, and most importantly, how we should be managing the Black Hills National Forest to prevent the next pine beetle epidemic. Without getting way down in the weeds, the Black Hills National Forest stalking has more than tripled since the late 1800s. It's went from 1.5 billion board feet to over 5 billion board feet. On the other hand, on the other side of the coin, timber outputs have declined about 30% from the early 90s to the present time. The insect epidemic and fires have adversely affected the Forest Service, the forest management program for nearly all resources and users, especially livestock grazing, recreationalists, adjacent landowners, and homeowners. I am concerned about the long-term effects on the health of the Black Hills National Forest, other resources and resource users, and on local businesses and communities. Our ponderosa pine forest rely on active management for long-term sustainability, just as our communities rely on the jobs and economic benefits resulting from that management. We have 2 major challenges ahead of us in the Black Hills now. First is in dealing with the fuels problem from all of the dead trees that we now have on the forest. And second, in implementing a forest management strategy to prevent another devastating mountain pine beetle epidemic. Achieving those will require increasing the pace and scale of management, streamlining the NEPA process, utilizing new farm bill authorities, fixing fire funding, very critical, and reducing costs to accomplish more work on the ground. Again, I feel blessed to be a part of this, and thank you for letting me testify.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Next, I'd like to have Karl Jensen provide his remarks. Karl?
Thanks, Greg. Karl Jensen, 3rd generation. I guess I'm 3rd generation rancher after a brief hiatus in a few other countries. My grandfather immigrated northern Black Hills we're still in business there. And the cattle industry, our interface with the forest, we also have forest allotment stuff. So the needs of the forest industry closely mirror the needs that we have as private ranchers. And I don't know up at Mr. Nyman's level, but when it gets down to the cowboys and the loggers, we have a lot in common. Appreciate it.
We have a ranch too.
There we go. I would just hit briefly on 3 points. One, I've been honored to be on a task force, statewide task force that came from Senate Bill 2. We have now on paper divided South Dakota into 9 watershed districts. This comes from my belief that any of these problems we treat, whether it's going to be forest-wide, that if we're going to deal with resource concerns across South Dakota, we need to look at it in terms of watersheds. We've made a lot of progress with it. There'll be another bill coming before your House and Senate here in the near future. We've taken some modest steps, but in the longer term, I wouldn't have sat through all those task force meetings if I didn't think looking at the state's resources statewide needs to be done on a watershed basis. We made a lot of progress toward that, and I'm hoping that we can get some support as it moves forward. We're looking at some modest steps. Of course, we're in South Dakota. Everybody's come up with 200 reasons why we shouldn't do it. But if we look at some of the surrounding states that have started to look at taking care of their natural resources on a watershed basis, they've made a lot of progress. And we're hoping to make the same kind of progress here. And I'd be happy to talk to anybody individually on that later on. Second point, when Greg laid out what we were supposed to do and look at issues that we need to deal with, I, of course, talked to other farmers and ranchers that have both forest lands and BLM lands. And universally, and I said I would represent them. If the environmental assessments are so important before we can put in a water line or something, then let's be able to do them in less than 2 or 3 years. That is the summation of what they said, and I've removed. People feel quite strongly about it. So I have cleaned up the language for this group. But in fact, I have no beef with doing an environmental assessment, of making sure that we preserve the things that are there. But if it's that important, it can't take 2 and 3 years to do it. When we have a drought, need to put in a water line, we can't let the bureaucratic issues hold us up. And that's something that I hope that the governors will look at. The programs of NRCS and these kind of things are critical, but we can't let 1 or 2 stumbling blocks hold up what in fact I think everybody's in concert, everybody agrees is a good idea. The third point, I worked for a long time in banking, and I sometimes was confused with being an economist. Actually, my background is more financial. When we look at the issues that are in the forest now, Mr. Nyman can explain to you very well how many board feet there are. So as a rancher and a heavy user of the Black Hills, all the down timber from the bug trees and then the subsequent storms that we had, and I guess we don't have tornadoes anymore. We have micro bursts. But those micro bursts laid a lot of dead timber down. And as all of you that are intimate with the forest know, even in the areas where they've been thinned and we've lost a lot of the dead timber, in fact, the live ones are coming down too because they no longer have the wind production. The end point of it is we have a lot of down timber. And from a financial standpoint, I can't see any way of recovering the pathways of the cattle, the pathways of the wildlife, the access to water, except for some fire. And I'm the last one. I'm a firm believer that we should not accelerate climate change in any manner, shape, or form. And yet I cannot see a financial alternative to actually having some prescribed fire. And I see that's on the list of topics to be later. But just talking day-to-day use, anybody that spent a day with a chainsaw, I'm not really good with a chainsaw. I'm fair with a chainsaw. But when you have to spend 3 and 4 hours reestablishing 100 yards of fence, you start thinking there's got to be another alternative. And unfortunately, I think we're gonna have to look at, actually, in the longer term, for the beauty and use of the Black Hills, we're gonna have to look at some fire because it's the only way. So the loggers can't afford to take it out. There's no use. We're gonna have to look at an alternative. That's my 3 points, and I'd be glad to talk either privately or in session later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Karl. Bob, turn it over to you.
Very good, thanks. I'm Bob Paulson with the Nature Conservancy. Thank the governor and Linda for hosting this event. I'm substituting for Carissa Krieger. She's at one of our partner groups in Watertown today with South Dakota Cattlemen at their annual meeting, and she'll be here tomorrow morning. And encourage you to introduce yourself to her as well. The Nature Conservancy is not well known. We work, just briefly, we work in 69 countries. We work to find common ground to benefit both wildlife and people. We started our work in South Dakota in 1961. We started our work in Western South Dakota in 1996 when I started the Western Dakotas program. The map is coming, I think, or there was one. Well, there we go. That's fine. Thank you. This map that is coming up will show our priority areas in Western South Dakota. The priority areas are in green and our completed projects are in yellow. So in the last 20, and it shows northeastern Wyoming, western South Dakota, a little bit of North Dakota and Montana as well. We've focused on these priority areas. We've identified them as relatively intact naturally and worthy of conservation, and that's where we focus our efforts. Many of them are focused around freshwater and riparian areas, native rangelands, as well as forested lands in the Black Hills. A couple points. Our program does pay property taxes. We are funded with private donations, mostly from individuals, most of it from South Dakota. And we do not pay over appraised value when we buy property. And we do a lot of work with, partner work with government organizations. We do land exchanges and that sort of thing. I'll touch on that in just a second. Trends is what I focused on, and I put them as either negative or positive for the 20 years that I've been working in Western South Dakota in conservation. A negative, grassland conversion to cropland is a negative. In the last 2 years, 3.7 million acres have been converted across the Great Plains. There were articles earlier this week in the Washington Post and yesterday in the Star Tribune about this study that was released by World Wildlife Fund, one of our partners. You can't do range management on cropland. You have to have rangeland to do range management. So when we're losing that amount of rangeland across the Great Plains, it's incredibly important to maintain land in range. Crop prices have dropped, commodity prices have dropped, so that's somewhat ameliorating the effect of the conversion that's been happening. Invasives are increasing, both non-native plants and animals. You just have to identify them and deal with them. That's another negative. I put as a plus, the prescribed fire is now accepted. It was discouraged, it was actively discouraged in the Black Hills on private lands through the year 2000 when the Jasper fire hit. We did a prescribed burn on private land in the Southern Black Hills in 1999. It was the first prescribed burn done on private land in the hills since the 1960s. We did our fire briefing up on the ridge above Alabaw Canyon, and the phone rang, and it was a previous governor on the phone to the fire boss, and you'll probably know which one I'm talking about. And he said, let them know that if they lose that fire, it's the last time they'll burn in my state. We didn't lose the fire. And so, the Governor Janko had a way of controlling things. So, but that was in 1999, literally a sea change with Jay Lesperance and Joe Lowe. Jay is now handling the prescribed burning in South Dakota. There's been a complete change in attitude towards prescribed fire, and I see that as a real positive because it was clamped down and avoided for so long. And we also have a strong private lands prescribed fire program in the Prairie Coteau of northeastern South Dakota, where we burn exclusively on private land. We provide grazing so that ranchers can rest their ranches and build fuels to run prescribed fire through their properties. Another plus, which is huge, I think, and ties into what Jim talked about, we still have a regional timber industry. Our number of sawmills in the last 20 years has been cut by at least half, I'd say, in the Black Hills. The Front Range of Colorado has lost that management tool. They no longer have any timber industry to go in and cut something if it needs to be managed. We need to maintain the timber industry in the Black Hills. It's very, 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 very important for conservation. Another plus, we have strong support for conservation easements. That is almost annually now challenged in the legislature. There's a waiting list of somewhat over 400 landowners now who want to do conservation easements when the funding becomes available. Another plus, we have an opportunity to consolidate intermingled ownerships. Custer State Park is the best example. 1912, Governor Norbeck consolidated all the sections 16 and 36, all the school sections within the National Forest into a 71,000 acre state park, the third largest park in the country. It's a prime example of consolidating ownership and simplifying management issues. We have the Conservancy holds conservation easements that protect the view shed, we'll call it, behind the annual buffalo roundup. What could be houses is now under a conservation easement. We specified the home building envelopes that they have to be behind the ridge, out of sight of the roundup on that easement, on those two easements. So we work very actively with partners like the state and areas like that, on projects like that. The Black Hills are unique. They're not the typical Western checkerboard. That, where you have, checkerboarded sections that are public and private and that sort of thing. That comes primarily for three reasons. Late settlement of reservation land. It was one of the last areas opened up for settlement. Placer mining claims where people were allowed to claim out the creek bottoms and riparian areas. And then, of course, the Enlarged Homestead Act of 1909 that took homesteading from 160 acres to 320, but more critical to the Black Hills, that allowed homestead entry surveys where you could actually do a meets and bounds, and you could leave out the timber, which was worthless for ranching. You could homestead and own the private meadows. And because of that, most of the winter range and a lot of the riparian areas in the Black Hills are private now. And that is quite an issue. When you think about the Black Hills, 1.2 million acres within the boundary, 300,000 acres of which in round numbers. And Craig or Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, but 300,000 acres are private. So, and then you compare that to the next national forest to the west, the Bighorn National Forest. We're 1.2 million acres, Bighorn is 1.5. We have 300,000 acres of inholdings. The Bighorn has 20,000 acres of inholdings. So it's a much more intermingled ownership and much more difficult to manage. You can't let fire run in the Black Hills. You have to control it. Let's see. We've completed land exchanges with 4 entities in the state: South Dakota School and Public Lands, blocking up their ownership along the one of the 2 last undammed rivers in the state, the Morrow and the White River. The Morrow is up there in one of those portfolio sites. We've worked with School and Public Lands, Black Hills National Forest. We've done 1 land exchange. We have another one underway right now. We just completed a land exchange on Buffalo Gap National Grassland with 14 partners. Those partners are all ranching families that wanted to acquire scattered parcels of land inside their private land. And a key one with Badlands National Park, the National Park Service, which this coming summer will allow bison hooves to hit pavement in Badlands National Park. Until now, if you wanted to see the bison herd in Badlands National Park, you had to drive 5 miles on gravel. As of this spring, there'll be herds and buffalo jams also in Badlands like we have in Custer State Park, because of a key little land exchange that the Kelly family was trying to exchange with the Park Service for 40 years. And we got that wrapped up last year. But there's a lack of funding for land exchanges. It's not a high priority. When Craig Bobstein starts the land exchange, Mark finishes it because it takes so long, 63 steps to do a land exchange. And nobody gets a gold star for doing a land exchange because you can't complete it during your term as a forest supervisor. It's very difficult, very challenging. But the funding is primarily tied up in fire borrowing right now, fighting wildfires. It's a low-key priority. Land exchanges take too long, so let's use that money. Let's not staff that position, and let's put it in the fire budget. So that's a negative, I would say. Another positive would be partnerships. We find common ground and we're proud of that, working with ranchers, but also NRCS is really stepping up with working lands for wildlife. The sage grouse initiative, which kept the sage grouse from being listed as endangered, and a real partnership focusing on riparian and riparian area health and freshwater concerns. In addition, with the state, the governor's Habitat Conservation Fund, which the Conservancy helped to fund, is it's small, but a lot of potential there to do some good conservation, primarily in the eastern part of the state, but there's potential out here as well. Greg already mentioned the Farm Bill and the opportunities there. That's a positive. I guess I'll end by saying a real positive is we have ongoing collaboration, coordination, and partnerships in place that we can build on and work from. And we're in a very good position that way. Folks know how to go along, get along. I've always said, you've heard the movie 6 Degrees of Separation in South Dakota, say it's 2. If you shake somebody's hand and you can't get to their father or their grandfather or grandmother within two leaps, it's a small state. It's kind of like a large city with long streets. It's pretty easy to get to know folks, and that really helps in the partnerships and the collaboration. That's a real advantage that South Dakota has. With that, I'm done.
Okay, thank you, Bob. Okay, with that, we'll open it up for questions and discussion. And I guess the way that this part of it will work is that, you know, if you want to direct your questions to the panelists, that's great. If you have a specific question you want to bring up here, we would like you to use a microphone because this is being recorded. So we want to make sure that we capture the question and that everyone can hear it. If somebody in the audience can contribute to the answer of a specific question, I would encourage that discussion to occur as well. It's pretty much going to be an open discussion from this point on. And I guess I'll start things off with a question to Mr. Nyman. You talked about the need for forest management strategy to prevent another mountain pine beetle epidemic from occurring. Could you elaborate on that a little bit for us, please?
Yeah. Thank you, Greg. I first want to just say one thing in reference to the governor, and been really impressed in this whole pine beetle and talking about thinning in what they've done in the Custer State Park. It's been pretty impressive, the reaction and how quick. So I see a pretty positive future there for Custer State Park and going forward in preventing that. But I could focus on three points, Greg. When you look at thin stands, you know, you need to kind of look back, and you've got a couple key people that have got a lot of evidence. Dr. Russ Graham and Dr. John Ball have a lot of evidence there, and a lot of that evidence goes clear back beyond and before them, and the success there on what thinning does. The second point I might talk about a little bit would be, when you look at the size of the industry, we've been very, very fortunate here to succeed and stay going, and I thank the Forest Service for that, and being one of the most successful forests, as the governor pointed out. But when you look at the size of us, we only treat 25 to 30,000 acres a year. You put that into perspective with 850 or 1.2 million acres, we can't treat but more than 2 or 3% of those acres when you have an epidemic. So we have to start being forward thinkers on how we're gonna react to the problem. So we've got to look at ways to make sure that this complete forest is a resilient forest, and we have to make sure that we look at what do we want the future desired condition of the complete forest, all acres, not allowing a bunch of high dense stands that can allow bug epidemics to either keep moving ahead. So it's, and I know there's restrictions between NEPA and other that really handcuffs the Forest Service, but that's the way we got to start thinking. Put it into perspective of our size, look at the history and the evidence of what works, and set a plan and start looking out 25, 50 years.
Quiet group. Question over here.
I'm Bob Burns. I'm a landowner near Piedmont. And this question is probably better for the next panel, but I have to go to a school board meeting, so I wanted to get out of the way. You talked about prescribed burns. Back in the early 70s, we did a lot of thinning on our property, and the state came in afterwards and facilitated doing prescribed burns in that thin area, had fire crews put in the fire lines, had their crews run the fire. And I know that ended, I think, with a fire that got away in Wind Cave. Will there be an effort to get back to a situation where the state can provide help to private landowners in doing prescribed burns? Because of the intermingling of property, there is a lot of land out there that could benefit by that, but private landowners are really incapable of doing something like a prescribed burn on their own property.
Yes. There is a lot that goes into that, but if you were to contact one of your state wildland fire offices and make a proposal, you have to understand that the smaller the tract that we're talking about burning, it's going to be more expensive, even though you might be utilizing some local volunteers. but I would suggest if you could get together with neighbors or even some of our federal partners like or state partners like we've done at Custer State Park Service and U.S. Forest Service, and do one larger burn. That'll greatly bring the cost down, but that's something we could work with you.
Just a quick comment, and our industry has done a 180-degree shift. We're still always cautious to make sure it's applied in the right times and the right time of year from burning. I'm looking at this on a bigger picture. I hope it's important in the Black Hills. We have a very tight-knit integrated industry, from a particle board plant to post and pull operations, 3 or 4 of them, and sawmills right now. And economics drives a lot of this, but I would hope we would see opportunities in the future with new innovative ideas to find solutions to get in, and those alternative, particularly in the urban interface where it's too dangerous to burn. And in some cases, whether yours applies or not, that we have an opportunity to remove that wood economically, or find ways to support and combine that with prescribed fire and find a solution to what you're trying to achieve.
Thank you. Rick Danver with the Western Landowners Alliance. I got a question for Karl. I was interested when you were talking about, taking a watershed approach. I work with a lot of different groups around the country, like you said, that seem to are getting fairly effective at being able to manage sustainably, build, find shared goals, build support. I was wondering if you'd elaborate a little bit more on what you'd like to see in terms of watershed management.
Sure. Thank you. The Belle Fourche River, and it's too big for any one county or any one district to deal with. Okay. We've got to start looking at things on a watershed basis. At that point, we formed a 501c3 made up of 3 conservation districts and an irrigation district, because the Belle Fourche River was an impaired water body. Okay, by forming together as a group rather than any one county or like that, I became convinced that there are things you can do on a watershed basis that you cannot do on any kind of individual basis. Subsequent to that, there was actually Senate Bill 2 introduced last year. And what we've done thus far, I was somehow placed on a task force to look at the issue statewide. What we've accomplished thus far is we've done the mapping, which was not easy, because I'm convinced of a couple things. One, people have very good intent. And number 2, the counties in South Dakota are too small. Okay, we need to look at watershed stuff. But in order to do that, we finally got down to township lines, and the watershed districts we've laid them out now. Everybody in the state would be part of a district. That'll be divided into sub-districts. The longer term thinking is that, yes, in fact, they may even have taxing authority to be able to do the things they do. But with the variants, and I've gotten more acquainted with eastern South Dakota since my role in this, where the problem's up on the Red River and on the James, where their continual problem is flooding, as opposed to out here where chances I live, we're trying to hang on to what water we have is the issue. And yet the whole issue across the board is you've got to look at the watershed as a whole. When people in northeastern South Dakota are trying to dig canals and tile and dump their water somewhere, it's affecting that watershed farther down. All the folks have to have a voice in dealing with the whole issue. So that's how much progress we've made thus far. We've made some small steps, but in the longer term, I think that this whole looking at the state's issues on a watershed basis make much more sense than on a conservation district. I am currently president of the South Dakota Association of Conservation Districts, but the issues we're looking at are bigger than any one conservation district or any one county or any one city. We need to look at what the effects of the entire watershed are. And that's why I've gotten to visit the Capitol a few times. And before I finish this, Mike, I do, because of the role I've been cast into, I do follow state politics a lot, try to keep up with what's going on. But I must say, on behalf of my wife, It's when Mrs. Dugard talks about what we need to do for the good of her grandchildren that my wife pays attention. So you both deserve a lot of credit for what you've done as far as leadership at the state.
Question in the back of the room.
Thank you. This is a question for Bob. I'm Dan Swingen with the U.S. Forest Service. You had mentioned land exchange. You have many years experience with that. As you say, with our agency, it's pretty laborious. Do you have any suggestions on what part of the process could be simplified and accelerated?
Well, there's basically in a Forest Service land exchange, and correct me if I'm wrong, Craig and Mark, but there are 63 steps at this point involved in that. And it's just incredibly detailed, you know, and I'm sure there's a bureaucratic reason for each one of them. But anything that you could do to tighten those up. I get calls, or the Conservancy and other conservation groups get calls every January when the property tax, or it's December now, when the property tax assessment comes out. And then we get calls in April when the first taxes are due. All those calls are from out-of-state landowners that own land in the forest. And it's a lot of it's undeveloped. It was Grandpa and Grandma's land. They would just as soon let it be the way it is and not be taxed at the higher, at the rate they're being taxed at. And they would love to see it go into the national forest and have some of these meadows. I've got 10 of them I can give you right now that would just as soon see their homesteads, their grandparents' homesteads go into the forest. But it takes too long. If we had a reliable takeout, the Conservancy, and the shortest land exchange I've done is 7 years. The longest one, I've been doing this for 20 years. It started 2 years before I started. And we still have some of that land in our inventory. And we're paying $9,000 a year in property taxes on those properties, waiting for this land exchange to go through. So if we had a reliable takeout, a 2 or 3 year takeout, we could pick up some of those pieces and consolidate them. And I think there's benefit for both timber industry, for grazing. The alternative, if they're not, if they get developed, they're going to be sold, they're going to be fenced off. You're not going to be able to hunt them. You're not going to be able to, they're going to be developed. They're going to go to trophy homes, and you see more and more of that in the Black Hills. I've got, as I said, probably at least 2,000 acres right now that we could buy. And if we could turn it in 3 years, we'd do it. We can't do that. So I can't tell you which specific steps, you know, why they're all there. It's just, and I know part of it was a land exchange, I think in the Southwest, where a forest supervisor profited from a sale to a buddy. And that added 5 more steps and a trip to DC. You know, it had to get a federal office review. So I'm sure there's good reasons for all these things, but if anything you could do to shorten those timeframes would be great. And the appraisals are good for 6 months. I paid for, on one land exchange, I paid for 3 appraisals on the same property because the appraisal expired. And the Forest Service, the person was detailed out, or they got sick, or, you know, the problem, and then just making it a priority, I guess, staffing wise. There's not a staff person. We had an incredible land ranger, and she's now in Missoula, or in Helena, Montana, I think it is, but she moved on. But you get a very skilled person, they get promoted up and out, and then you start over. And just a quick story, we did the Pass Creek land exchange that's one of the ones where we still own 3 pieces of land, you know, from 1994, I think we bought those parcels. The goal was to protect the underground resource of Jewel Cave. It was private land just outside the cave. The cave was known to go underneath these properties, and they didn't want to have septic tanks and wells, you know, drilled on these properties. I walked into it, there were 2 of us with the Conservancy, there were 13 feds involved, BLM, Park Service, Forest Service. When that land exchange ended, I went to the meeting. There was one person from the Conservancy, and I'd been at the first one. There were 16 feds, but none of the 16 feds were the same, were the original 13. So we became the institutional memory for the Forest Service. Why are we doing this? You know, the turnover is incredible. So that's another frustration. But I'd say staffing is probably the first thing. If you get a land ranger that will stay in place and becomes a priority for the forest to complete a land exchange, I think it would benefit all of our concerns at this table.
Hi, I'm Christy Masco with the Sustainable Rangelands Roundtable. My question is for Mr. Jensen. You mentioned the lag time in getting EISs done. And I guess I wondered, you know, you go to a lot of meetings and that's commonly identified as an issue. I guess I wondered if there has been any discussion around solutions and possible ways to expedite that. I know on the forestry side, they've had some good luck working with the Good Neighbor Authority.
It's still an issue, and thank you. It's still an issue, and there is some hope. I think the fact too that they've, like with NRCS, they've qualified more people to be able to do an environmental assessment or EIS, depending on whether you're a forest or private land stuff. They're getting more people qualified to do it. But in the longer term, it does not take 2 years to do those kinds of things. I don't know what the absolute answer is, but if it's going to be a priority, then it needs to be, you know, that we have to have this done before we can move any dirt. If in fact it's a priority, then let's make it a priority. That's one of the things that can be done as quickly as you can get a hold of somebody to come out and drop that water line in for you. I don't know the absolute answer, but it can't be, because a lot of times, in fact, they've had to go look for people that were recently retired and this sort of thing. I believe it's an important issue, but it has to be made important that people say, this is something that if I identify a piece of ground that we want to make sure we're not destroying anything we go through, that we can do that assessment, not in 2 years, but something we can get out and do in a couple of weeks. We probably need a core of people. I don't know the absolute answer. I'll defer to some of my colleagues that are in government.
Hi, I'm Chip Kimball. I'm with the Bureau of Land Management out of Belle Fourche. And we have the same situation where we are have to do NEPA to do everything that we do on the ground. And one thing that no one's brought up to date in the course of these conversations has been the cultural considerations in the Black Hills and the northern Black Hills particularly. So not only historic but prehistoric issues that we run across, and I'm sure the forest runs into the same issues that we do, and that there's not only NEPA requirements, but there's several Section 106 and other requirements that we have to meet. And unfortunately, all that stuff takes time. So yeah, that's also part of it, but it probably should be part of the discussion.
I can tell you what not to do. When I was building the golf course at Hewlett, there were some big wagon tracks from the late 1800s, and Dad took the shippo lady across there, and she says, "Oh, we got to save these." And she said, "Listen, ma'am, if you want more of those, I'll make all the damn tracks you want, but so don't take that approach."
Other comments, questions for the panelists?
Hi, Christine Dahl, the U.S. Forest Service. I guess for all of the panelists, what one thing would you share that you think has gone exceptionally well in South Dakota that the other states could benefit from, or Forest Service in other regions could benefit from?
Clearly, I think what was touched on by the governor, we have just such a unique situation here with this island. It's a Hawaiian island in the middle of a prairie with 7 counties surrounding it and not that many people. The collaborative process the governor talked about that was worked on partly by the industry and other collaborative groups, the multiple use organizations, the different efforts, so we can call them collaboratives or not. But that consensus and educating all the other partners and users of the forest on each of us, I really see that, and particularly a strong, close working relationship between industry, states, counties, city governments, and the U.S. Forest Service is part of the reason I think we have success here. We had to have that local support to get regional support, to get national support. As much as I complained earlier on where I think we need to go, I'm looking ahead to see success so we can eliminate problems. But when I look backwards, that would be what I would say was the most successful part, if that answers your question.
And not the Forest Service per se, but we talked about, and Bob had the figure, 300,000 acres of privately held land. When the the beetles, the pine beetle does not recognize boundaries. And with the private lands and stuff, I would be remiss if I didn't compliment the South Dakota Department of Agriculture, where we came up with a program for marking those trees on private lands and stuff, which were immediately adjacent. It was an enormously successful people that had their the marking rate. I heard figures from your own foresters of 95% accuracy and this sort of thing. And that was a matter of collaboration between the conservation districts, the South Department of Ag, particularly Bill's shop and Greg's shop, was enormously successful. And it was a partnership that would not have happened without both state and local cooperation outside, in the forest, on the private lands.
I guess the only thing I'd add that would probably be unique to South Dakota is the relationships and the partnerships that we have here. Working together and everybody's who lives here lives in South Dakota for a reason. They like the lifestyle, the climate, or whatever, especially around the Black Hills. But I think taking advantage of that, we don't have the influx of coastal people, if you will, and the lines haven't hardened yet as far as between. We're a conservation group. We're not an environmental group. We don't litigate. The Conservancy doesn't. We look for common ground, and I think there's still that potential in South Dakota and hopefully in other states to the west. I'd say that's probably more unique in South Dakota than many of the western states, where you get people moving out of the large cities and gentrifying it, so to speak, and building their fourth and fifth homes.
Mr. Nyman, you were talking about, you talked a little bit about issues or difficulties with dealing with thinning the forests, and I was curious whether you see that things could that be made easier with better funding for forest restoration within the Forest Service? I mean, is it a lack of manpower and funding issues to get that done, or are there other barriers to be able to deal with the NEPA and get management plans in place?
You're identifying what I think is one of the critical issues is NEPA, but also the interpretation at the different levels on how to react to NEPA too. Litigation can really drive, it can really handcuff the Forest Service. So you might have a law like NEPA. When it's done, they take the most conservative approach. They have to take a zero risk approach to it. So the intent of the law might be different in what the results and the impacts are that come from it. So we've got to relook at those laws and take off the handcuffs of the Forest Service so they can move faster. Part of the issue here is that when you continue to have more growth than you have harvest, you're going to continue to add to the ground. When you've had fires and bugs, now you're going to have a lot of overstory, and now you're going to have a whole new understory. So funding will be an issue. It has been an issue all along. So we've got to find a combination of increase in production, increase in efficiencies, and get them additional funds. When you go back to the two major points that I made, that we've got to start figuring out how to deal with all the dead trees, and that's going to be damn expensive. So that's going to be a serious part.
I guess I'd just like to add to that, probably the one area that Jim and I disagree on is I think there's value in all types, all forest types, and there does need to be some old growth forest left in the Black Hills in small patches, but that is not necessarily included in the normal timber cycle. I think there's value in that just for diversity and for variety and that sort of thing. And that's sorting that out is what takes time. Which ones should be left alone and which ones, the bulk of it probably should be harvested, because this is a burned ecosystem in the Black Hills. We evolved with fire, and we've held fire out because of private assets in the forest and private ownership and that sort of thing primarily. So short of burning through the hills regularly, you have to manipulate it mechanically, and that's where the timber industry comes in. But I think there still needs to be a broad, we need to appreciate the diversity of this forest and the rangeland areas too, especially the riparian and freshwater areas out on the prairies. It's very important that we maintain the health of those.
Bob sometimes is the first and sometimes I'm the first to bring up that might be our only disagreement is the large trees. But really it comes down to what percentage of those large trees. But one of the real things I'd like to focus on and hit on that kind of comes back, if we could focus on resiliency, the one common thread all three of us have up here, and Bob and I can sit down and we can't hardly find a difference, is water. If you focus on water and focus on clean water and look at a 24-inch ponderosa pine tree can drink up to 200 gallons a day, and look at how many we got and look at the density. Water production and clean water, it's important that we have a healthy, resilient forest, and we can be a huge provider of water for the streams that then affects the conservation districts, the farmers, ranchers downstream. Water is a very integral part, clear to all parts, our drinking water and rapid, every part. It's the one common thread.
If I could just add that point, like I said, it's hard to find many differences. It's like when I'm talking to a logger, 95%, except for maybe closing the gates, 95% of the stuff we agree on. But I think one of the issues with the Black Hills, and I also have, I think there's people all over that are envious that we have both a beautiful and productive forest. But this diversity is somewhat of an issue too. It's been brought to my attention by our foresters. And now they're looking at trying to reestablish some of the aspen growth. There's nothing harder to work with than a monoculture. And by some of these activities now that we're undertaking to diversify in the longer term, I think will serve us all better.
I guess just to add to that, one thing that many people don't realize or appreciate is the Black Hills is the only mountain range in the West without perennial snowpack. We rely on water that, we don't have snow year round. We don't have glacial melt. We don't have, if you go over to the Bighorns, it's white over there all summer long. And that's one thing that's very different about the Black Hills. And that literally probably will become a cap to our population. How much water, how many people can we serve in the Black Hills? I know it was an issue in Deadwood and gambling and that sort of thing. How many motel rooms could we service? And there was a study done, how many gallons per day per motel room. And, but I think water is absolutely key on many levels, but the lack of a snowpack is the real limiting factor for the Black Hills.
Jeff Marlette with Senator Round's office. A common theme through a lot of this is overregulation, possibly. Have we reached a point where we can get consensus between private industry, ranchers, and the people who are, or the agencies that are trusted to manage those public lands to say we've gone too far? Some of it I think is executive order that has become policy, sometimes tested in the court, sometimes not. Are we at a point where we see overregulation in all kinds of parts of business that is crippling small business? Do you think that we're at that point where we could now come forward to Congress or to the courts and say, we need to back this up on NEPA or some things so that it doesn't take as long, so it isn't as burdensome?
Absolutely, and we'd be foolish if we didn't do that. You look at the aggressiveness of what's going on at the national level with the change in administration. We can't speak with the soft voice today, or the aggressive voice that we see them put together at the White House is not going to hear us. We're going to have to be bold with our words, whether it's about NEPA or whatever. If we want to get something done, we've got to lay it on the line in very bold words and try to change NEPA and get less regulation. Just look at what Obamacare has done and the changes there. See how that transpires, but you're going to see changes. So why shouldn't we see? That's the only way we're going to be able to give and answer your question. How are we going to improve things going forward, and how are we going to reduce cost? And what I put together, all the changes that I put in my final list there is going to take changes to do that. We have to be bold. and unified within the states as the governor's trying to do here.
Yeah, no, somehow forest health morphed into healthcare. Having said
Sometimes
that,
they're both sick.
sometimes they're both, but like I said, again, I think, yeah, I'm all for reduced regulation, but it's something that needs to be done with a scalpel and not with an axe. There are 20 million people that have obtained health care under the Affordable Care Act that did not have it before. We need to streamline, we need to reduce spending, we need, I think streamlining is the issue rather than elimination. There's a lot of people, and the people I've had the opportunity to work with the Forest Service over the years. I think when we first started looking at the beetle issues, the first thing that Mr. Bobson did was call in the conservation districts to say, you know, from you guys' perspective, what do we need to do and stuff. And I think in the longer term, I'm all for streamlining, but as we start to eliminate things, it's not just that we have to wipe out regulatory agencies. I think we just need to make them more efficient, and we don't need to hamstring them time and time again.
I guess the only thing that I'd add is, you know, the fire borrowing, that needs to be addressed. The way the fire funding for wildfires and that sort of thing, that is really hampering the federal agencies in particular. That's probably just basically a lot of these things, these 63 steps of land exchange are unfunded mandates. You need to do all these things, but we're not going to give you the money to do it. So I think if we can figure out firefighting funding, that would go a long ways to solve a lot of ills. And if you could, you know, if you do a NEPA assessment, but get it done quickly, but get it funded, and that just takes money, fixes everything, right? But fire funding or wildfire fighting is got to be figured out.
I think we'll take one question, and since I'm already talking, I'll ask the question. And I think this one is for Greg, because it's something that we need to touch on here, which is one of the 4 elements of what the initiative is trying to do, but we're not going to get into specifically. But I'd still like you to touch on South Dakota and the use of those Farm Bill authorities like stewardship contracting and good neighbor authority, both of which allow in the former local communities and the latter states to leverage basically cost share dollars to help fund management activities. And so my question, Greg, for you would be, can you just give us a really quick assessment of have you been able to take advantage of those authorities? Have those been successes or not? And based on your experience, are there things you would do to tweak how those authorities work to make them more accessible to South Dakota and more effective in terms of how they work?
Okay. As mentioned earlier, we're just in the completion phase of getting our master agreement for good neighbor authority done. So I don't have any direct experience with that, although I've been watching other states and how they've used it. And and in conversations I've had with some of the district rangers here on the Black Hills, I think there's potential for its use. And you know, we're probably going to start out small, but I think there's some real good potential here. You know, one of the biggest issues that I've heard other states talk about is the difference between the Good Neighbor Authority that was authorized under the Appropriations Act versus Good Neighbor under the Farm Bill. And one of the things that the Farm Bill did not include was things like permanent road maintenance and parking lots and things like that. I don't necessarily see that as being a big problem in South Dakota, because the Black Hills is pretty well roaded. And I think probably temporary roads are probably a good solution here in the Black Hills. So, you know, without having any experience, I'm just going to make the prediction that I don't think that's going to be a real serious problem here. And not only that, but the The areas that we're talking about where the state might be able to provide a service to the Black Hills National Forest is isolated parcels where they have a lot of problems getting access across private lands. And I think probably we'll be able to utilize some mechanisms that will be a little bit easier to gain that access. So, that's one issue that I see other states dealing with that I don't necessarily think is going to be a big problem here. As far as stewardship authority is concerned, we don't have any direct experience with that, but Pennington County does. They've been doing a stewardship, working under a stewardship agreement for working on right-of-ways to deal with dead trees from mountain pine beetle and pine beetle infested trees, county right-of-ways in Pennington County. And I think they're going to talk about that a little bit more in tomorrow's case study. Those two authorities, we haven't had the opportunity to have experience with them yet. So hope that answers your question.
With that, I think we're going to cut you guys loose.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.